A woman in a $5,000 suit grabbed a 7-year-old boy's toy fighter jet and shoved it into the seat pocket in front of him. "Keep your cheap little toys to yourself," she snapped. The boy's eyes filled with tears. His father, a man with grease-stained hands and worn-out boots, sat frozen. Not because he was weak, but because the last time he moved that fast, he was pulling 9 Gs in an F-22 Raptor at 40,000 feet. What happened next on that plane silenced every single passenger. And what happened on the tarmac? That broke the internet. Comment your city so I can see how far this story has traveled. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and follow along, because this story is just getting started. Daniel Carter hadn't slept in 31 hours. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from fatigue. He'd pulled a double shift at the garage, 12 hours under the hoods of trucks that belonged to men who never looked him in the eye. Then he'd driven straight to his mother-in-law's house to pick up his son, packed a bag in 9 minutes, and made it to the airport with nothing to spare. His boy Ethan walked beside him through the terminal, dragging a backpack that was too big for his small frame. In his right hand, he clutched a scratched-up toy F-22 Raptor. The paint was peeling off the wings. One of the landing gears was missing. But that toy never left the boy's hand. Not at school, not at dinner, not when he slept. It was the last gift his mother ever gave him. Daniel didn't talk about that. Not to anyone. Not even to Ethan. They reached the gate, and Daniel pulled out the boarding passes. Business class, row 3, window and middle. The gate agent looked at the passes, then looked at Daniel. She looked at his boots. She looked at his jacket. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile people give when they're trying not to say something. "Business class?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. You're aware this is the business class boarding group." Daniel felt his jaw tighten. "I'm aware." She scanned the passes and handed them back without another word. Ethan tugged his father's sleeve. "Dad, why'd she look at us like that?" "She was just doing her job, buddy." "She looked at us the way Mrs. Patterson looks at me when I forget my homework." Daniel squeezed the boy's shoulder. "Don't worry about it. Let's go find our seats." They walked down the jetway. Daniel could feel the stairs before he even entered the cabin. The flight attendant at the door gave a polite nod, but her eyes dropped to his boots and stayed there a beat too long. Row 3. Daniel let Ethan slide in by the window. The boy pressed his face against the glass immediately, holding the toy jet up against the real planes on the tarmac. "Dad, look! That one's a 737, and that one's an Airbus. You can tell by the nose." Daniel smiled. "That's right, but none of them are as cool as the Raptor." "No," Daniel said quietly. "No, they're not." He sat down in the middle seat and buckled in. The aisle seat was empty. He allowed himself one slow breath. Maybe this flight would be simple. Maybe nobody would bother them. Maybe for once, the world would just leave them alone. It didn't. She arrived like a weather system. Victoria Ashford. Tailored charcoal suit, diamond earrings, a leather bag that probably cost more than Daniel's truck. She stopped at row 3 and looked at the seat assignment on her boarding pass, then looked at Daniel, then looked at the seat again, as if recalculating whether reality had made an error. "This is my seat," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Aisle's all yours." She didn't move. She stood there, examining him the way a health inspector examines a kitchen. "Is that motor oil?" she asked. Daniel looked down at his hands. He'd scrubbed them 3 times at the garage sink, twice more at his apartment. But the grease had been there so long it had become part of him. It lived in the creases of his knuckles, under his nails, in the calluses that covered both palms. "I'm a mechanic," he said. "Clearly." She sat down. She made a show of adjusting her jacket so it wouldn't touch his sleeve. She pulled out a leather portfolio and opened it, creating a physical wall between them. Ethan leaned forward and looked at her. "Hi, I'm Ethan." Victoria didn't look up. I'm 7. Do you want to see my jet?" He held up the toy Raptor. One wing was held together with a piece of tape. Victoria glanced at it for exactly half a second. "No. It's an F-22 Raptor. My mom gave it to me. It can go Mach 2. That's faster than—" "I know what Mach 2 is," Victoria cut him off. "I work with the people who build these things." Daniel put his hand gently on Ethan's knee. "Hey, bud, let the lady work." "But Dad—" "I know. Just play with it quietly, okay?" Ethan pulled back into a seat, holding the jet against his chest. He didn't say anything else, but Daniel saw the way the boy's face changed. That small collapse around the eyes. That micro-flinch that happens when a child learns, one more time, that the world doesn't want to hear him. Daniel had seen that face too many times. He'd worn it himself once. The plane taxied. The safety demonstration played. Victoria typed furiously on her laptop, occasionally sighing at the noise of the engines, as though the aircraft itself was an inconvenience built specifically to annoy her. Ethan made quiet jet sounds with his mouth, flying the toy Raptor in slow arcs between his knees. He kept the sound low. He kept his elbows in. He was trying so hard to be small, to take up less space. Daniel watched his son and felt something hot and sharp behind his ribs. "You shouldn't have to shrink yourself," he thought. "You're 7 years old. You shouldn't have to make yourself invisible so somebody in a suit feels comfortable." But he said nothing, because saying something meant making a scene, and making a scene meant the boy would remember it. And Daniel had promised himself, the day he buried Sarah, that his son would remember as few bad days as possible. 15 minutes after takeoff, the drink cart came through. Daniel ordered a ginger ale for Ethan and a coffee for himself. When the flight attendant handed over the drinks, Victoria leaned across Daniel without warning. "Could you also bring me a sparkling water? And could you speak to someone about the noise level in this section? There's a child playing with a toy, and it's incredibly distracting." The flight attendant glanced at Ethan, who had frozen mid-play, the Raptor suspended in the air between his hands. "Ma'am, he's being very quiet," the attendant said. "He's making engine sounds." "Barely audible engine sounds," the attendant replied. "This is business class. I paid for a professional environment." Daniel spoke before the attendant could respond. His voice was steady, not aggressive, not passive, just steady. "Ma'am, my son is sitting quietly and playing with a toy. He hasn't bumped your seat. He hasn't raised his voice. He's a 7-year-old kid on a plane. If the sound of a child existing bothers you, I'd suggest noise-canceling headphones. They're probably in the catalog in front of you." Victoria turned to face him. Her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." For a long moment, they just looked at each other. The entire forward cabin felt the shift. 2 passengers across the aisle glanced over. The flight attendant hovered awkwardly. Victoria leaned in slightly. "Do you know who I am?" "No, ma'am. And I don't need to. I'm the Senior Vice President of Strategic Acquisitions at Harmon Defense Systems. I sit in rooms where decisions are made about aircraft that fly over your head every single day. I have dinner with generals. I brief Pentagon officials." Daniel looked at her for a long beat. "That's impressive." "It should be." "And yet here you are, on the same plane as me, bothered by a 7-year-old's toy." Someone 2 rows back let out a small laugh. Victoria heard it. Her face flushed. She turned away and jammed her earbuds in. She didn't speak to them again. But the damage was done. Daniel could see it. Ethan had pulled his knees up to his chest. The Raptor was tucked under his arm, hidden. The boy stared out the window with that blank expression children learn when they've been told too many times that they don't belong. "Hey," Daniel said softly. Ethan didn't look at him. "Ethan, look at me." The boy turned. His eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying. He was holding it in, the way his father held things in. Like father, like son. "You didn't do anything wrong," Daniel said. "She doesn't like me." "She doesn't know you. That's different." "She doesn't like you either." Daniel exhaled through his nose. "Yeah, well, I've had people not like me before." "Because of your hands?" The question hit Daniel in a place he didn't expect. "What do you mean?" "Your hands are always dirty. Kids at school say you're dirty. They say we're poor. They say that's why Mom left." Daniel's throat closed. He couldn't speak for 3 full seconds. When he did, his voice was rough. "Your mom didn't leave, Ethan. She got sick. You know that." "I know, but they don't." "Then they don't know the truth." "But it still hurts." Daniel reached over and pulled his son against his side. The boy's head rested against his ribs. The toy raptor pressed between them. "Listen to me," Daniel said. "These hands you're talking about. These dirty hands. These hands changed the oil in Mrs. Ramirez's car last week so she could drive to her chemo appointment. These hands fixed Mr. Tran's transmission so he could get to work and feed his family. These hands packed your lunch this morning. These hands held your mom's hand in the hospital when nobody else could stay." He paused. "These hands aren't dirty, son. They're proof that I showed up." Ethan looked at his father's hands. He studied them like he was seeing them for the first time. The scars, the grease, the cracked skin around the knuckles. Then the boy took his father's hand and held it. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. They sat like that for a while. The plane hummed. Victoria typed on her laptop. Passengers read their magazines and drank their coffees and lived inside their own private worlds, unaware that something real and raw and important had just happened in row 3. Then the turbulence hit. It came without warning. A violent drop that sent cups flying and overhead bins rattling. The fasten seatbelt signs slammed on. A passenger in the back screamed. And then the captain's voice came through the intercom. But it wasn't the smooth, rehearsed tone passengers were used to. It was tight. Controlled. The kind of tight and controlled that Daniel recognized instantly, because he'd used that exact voice himself. Once, in a cockpit 35,000 feet above Afghanistan, when his left engine caught fire, and the ground below was nothing but mountains and enemy territory. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've encountered a technical issue with one of our flight systems. As a precautionary measure, we'll be diverting to a nearby airfield. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight crew, prepare the cabin." The cabin erupted in whispers. A man across the aisle pulled out his phone and started texting rapidly. A woman behind them began praying in Spanish. Victoria Ashford gripped both armrests so hard, her knuckles turned white. Ethan looked up at his father. "Dad?" "Yeah, buddy." "Are we going to crash?" Daniel looked into his son's eyes. Big, wide, trusting. The same eyes Sarah had. The same shade of gray-green that Daniel saw every morning and every night. The ghost of the woman he loved, staring back at him from a 7-year-old's face. He could lie. He could panic. He could freeze. He did none of those things. He listened. The engine tone was wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, but wrong enough. A subtle oscillation in the left turbofan that most passengers wouldn't notice. But Daniel wasn't most passengers. He had spent 4 years listening to twin Pratt & Whitney F-119 engines at full afterburner. He could hear the difference between a healthy engine and a sick one, the way a musician hears a note slightly off key. He checked the descent angle by the feel of the seat pressing into his back. He noted the wind correction by the slight yaw to the right. He counted seconds between the captain's announcement and the change in flap configuration. Everything tracked. The pilots were doing it right. Standard diversion protocol. By the book. Daniel wrapped his arm around Ethan and pulled him close. "We're okay," he said. "The pilots know what they're doing." "How do you know?" Daniel paused. "Because I used to do what they do." Ethan stared at him. "You were a pilot?" "A long time ago." "You never told me that." "I know." "Why?" Daniel didn't answer right away. The plane banked left. The ground was coming up. He could feel the gear deploying through the vibration in the floor. "Because that was a different life," he said finally. "And this life, with you, is the one that matters." Victoria was leaning forward in her seat, breathing hard. Her laptop had fallen to the floor. Her composure, her authority, her $5,000 confidence, all of it was gone. She was just a person, afraid, in a metal tube falling through the sky. She turned to Daniel. Her voice was small. "Are we going to be okay?" Daniel looked at her. This woman who had dismissed his son, who had recoiled from his hands, who had recited her title like it was a shield. He could have ignored her. He didn't. "We're landing at an Air Force base. The descent rate is stable. The pilots are executing a textbook diversion. We'll be on the ground in 4 minutes." She stared at him. "How do you know all that?" "I just do." 3 minutes and 42 seconds later, the wheels touched concrete. Hard, but controlled. The kind of landing that military runways demand. The cabin erupted in applause. People clapped and cheered and laughed, the nervous laugh of people who just remembered they were alive. Daniel didn't clap. He sat perfectly still, his arm around his son, his eyes closed. He was listening to the engines spool down. He was feeling the reverse thrust engage. He was counting the distance to full stop by the deceleration rate pushing against his chest. Old habits. They never really die. Ethan held the toy Raptor against the window and looked out at the airfield. His eyes went wide. "Dad," he whispered. "Dad, look." Daniel opened his eyes and looked. Lined up along the far side of the taxiway, gleaming under the brutal Texas sun, were 6 F-22 Raptors. Real ones. Daniel's breath caught in his chest. He hadn't seen one up close in 3 years. Not since the day he walked away from everything. Not since Sarah's diagnosis. Not since he traded a flight suit for coveralls and a call sign for a name tag that read, Danny, at a garage in Fort Worth. He stared at those jets and felt something crack open inside him. Something he'd welded shut a long time ago. Ethan pressed the toy against the glass and held it up next to the real thing. "Dad," the boy whispered, "they're the same." Daniel couldn't speak. He just nodded. And for the first time in 3 years, his eyes burned. The passengers filed off the plane slowly, the way people move when they've just been reminded that the ground is a gift. Some of them were on their phones already, calling wives, calling husbands, calling anyone who would listen. A few were crying. Most were just quiet, carrying their bags with the dazed look of people who needed to sit down and not move for a while. Daniel stood in the aisle and waited. He let others go first. Not because he was patient, because his legs didn't want to move. Those jets on the tarmac had done something to him. Cracked open a door he'd spent 3 years nailing shut. He could feel it now. The rush of air from the other side, cold and familiar and dangerous. Memories he hadn't invited. Sounds he hadn't given permission to replay. The whine of twin Pratt & Whitneys spooling up at dawn. the click of his oxygen mask locking into place, the voice of his weapons systems officer reading off coordinates in a tone so calm it could have been a grocery list. "Dad, come on!" Ethan tugged his hand. "I want to see the jets." Daniel blinked. "We can't just walk up to them, bud. This is a military base." "But they're right there." "I know, but there are rules." "You always say that." "Because there are always rules." They walked up the jetway and into a small terminal that clearly wasn't built for commercial passengers. It was a military transit facility. Concrete floors, metal chairs bolted to the ground, a vending machine in the corner that looked like it had been there since the first Gulf War. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead and gave everything a pale, washed-out look that Daniel recognized from 100 military buildings he'd walked through in another lifetime. Airline staff were trying to organize things. A gate agent stood near a folding table with a clipboard, explaining to frustrated passengers that a replacement aircraft was being arranged, and the delay would be approximately 2 to 3 hours. Victoria Ashford was already at the table, demanding answers. Her voice carried across the room. 2 to 3 hours is unacceptable. I have a meeting in Washington at 6. Do you understand what's at stake? Ma'am, we're doing everything we can. Everything you can isn't good enough. Get me on another flight. Charter something. I don't care what it costs. Ma'am, this is a military installation. We can't charter civilian aircraft from here. Then get me a car, a helicopter, something. Daniel walked past her without a word. He found 2 empty chairs near the far wall and sat Ethan down. The boy immediately pulled out the toy Raptor and started flying it in slow loops, making engine sounds so quiet they were almost just breath. "You hungry?" Daniel asked. "A little." "Let me see what that vending machine's got." Daniel walked over and fed 4 crumpled dollar bills into the machine. He got a bag of pretzels and a bottle of water. The machine ate his 5th dollar without giving anything back. He stared at it for a moment, then hit the side of it with the heel of his palm. Nothing. He hit it again. Still nothing. A voice behind him said, "You gotta hit it lower. Bottom left. The coin mechanism sticks." Daniel turned around. A young man in a flight suit was standing there, maybe 28, 30 at most. Lieutenant's bars on his shoulders. A patch on his chest that read 58th Fighter Squadron. And on his sleeve, the unmistakable silhouette of an F-22 Raptor. Daniel felt his pulse shift. "Thanks," he said. He hit the machine where the lieutenant indicated. A granola bar dropped out. "Works every time," the young pilot said, grimming. "That machine's been broken since I got stationed here. Nobody fixes it. We just learn its personality." Daniel almost smiled. "Sounds about right." The lieutenant glanced at Daniel's hands, then at his boots, then back at his face. It was the same scan everyone had given him today, but there was something different in this kid's eyes. Not judgment. Something else. Something searching. "You waiting on the replacement aircraft?" the lieutenant asked. "Yeah, my son and I were on the diverted flight." "Rough ride?" "Engine oscillation in the left turbofan. Probably a compressor issue. Pilots handled it well." The lieutenant's eyebrows went up. "You caught that from the cabin?" "Hard to miss. Most people can't tell turbulence from a compressor stall." "I'm not most people." The lieutenant studied him for a long moment. Daniel could see the gears turning behind the young man's eyes. "What do you do?" the pilot asked. "I'm a mechanic. Auto shop in Fort Worth." "Before that?" Daniel picked up the granola bar and turned it over in his hands. "Before that doesn't matter much anymore." "Fair enough." The lieutenant stuck out his hand. "Lieutenant Jake Rollins. I fly the 22. Daniel shook his hand. "Daniel Carter." Something changed in Jake Rollins' face. It was subtle. A flicker. A pause. The kind of reaction a person has when they hear a name they've heard before, but can't immediately place. Daniel Carter, the lieutenant repeated. That's right. Huh. Jake tilted his head slightly. Have we met? No. You sure? Because your name is really familiar. I get that a lot. Common name. Jake nodded slowly, but he didn't look convinced. He glanced at Daniel one more time, opened his mouth like he was going to say something else, then thought better of it. Well, hope the rest of your trip goes smoother, Mr. Carter. Take care of that kid. Always do. Jake walked away. Daniel watched him go. The lieutenant joined a group of 3 other pilots near the entrance to the restricted side of the terminal. They were laughing about something, holding paper coffee cups, their flight suits unzipped to the waist in the way fighter pilots do when they're off the clock, but still on base. Daniel carried the pretzels and water back to Ethan. Here, eat. Thanks, Dad. Ethan tore open the bag. Who was that guy? A pilot. A Raptor pilot? Yeah. Did you tell him you used to fly? No. Why not? Because it's not important. It's important to me. Daniel sat down next to his son and let out a breath that felt like it weighed 40 pounds. Ethan, when your mom got sick, I had to make a choice. I could keep flying, or I could come home and take care of her. Take care of you. I couldn't do both. I know. So I hung it up, turned in my wings, and I don't regret it, not for 1 second. But you miss it. Daniel didn't answer. I can tell, Ethan said. When planes fly over our house, you always stop and look up. You always listen, and sometimes, when you think I'm asleep, you go out on the porch and just watch the sky. The boy was 7 years old, and he saw everything. Yeah, Daniel said quietly. I miss it. Then why don't you tell people? Why do you pretend you were never a pilot? Because it feels like bragging about somebody else's life. That guy, that pilot, he doesn't exist anymore. I'm just a mechanic now. I'm just your dad. You're not just anything, Dad. Daniel looked at his son. The boy had pretzel crumbs on his chin and a toy jet in his lap, and eyes that were too wise for 7. When'd you get so smart? Daniel asked. Mom told me I got it from you. Daniel's chest tightened. He reached over and brushed the crumbs off the boy's chin. Eat your pretzels. 20 minutes passed. Passengers settled into the uncomfortable rhythm of waiting. Some paced, some slept in chairs. A couple argued quietly near the restrooms. Victoria Ashford sat alone, typing on her phone with the intensity of someone conducting a war campaign through text messages. Then the restricted access door opened. Jake Rollins came through it, and he wasn't alone. 2 more pilots followed him. An older one, maybe mid-40s, with a major's oak leaves on his shoulders and the kind of weathered face that comes from years of pulling G's at the edge of human tolerance. Behind him, a younger woman, a captain, with a squadron patch Daniel recognized immediately. The 94th. Hat in the ring. The oldest fighter squadron in the United States Air Force. They were walking with purpose, not casual, not aimless. They were heading somewhere specific. They were heading toward Daniel. Jake stopped about 10 feet away. His face had changed completely from the easy grin he'd worn at the vending machine. He looked like a man who just found out something that rearranged everything he thought he knew. Mr. Carter, Jake said. Daniel stood up slowly. Lieutenant, sir, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Daniel felt every muscle in his body go still. All right. Jake pointed at Daniel's left wrist. That bracelet, the steel one. Can I see it? Daniel looked down at his wrist, the memorial band. He'd worn it so long he'd forgotten it was visible. Brushed steel, thin, engraved on the inside with names and dates. On the outside, a single word. He held up his wrist. Jake leaned in and read it. Then he stepped back. His face went white. "Hawk 1, Jake said. The terminal seemed to shrink. The noise of frustrated passengers, the buzzing lights, the hum of the vending machine, all of it faded to nothing. The major stepped forward. His name tag read, Collins. His eyes were locked on Daniel with an intensity that bordered on disbelief. "You're Hawk 1, Major Collins said. It wasn't the question. Daniel didn't move. "I was. Sir, we study your missions at weapons school. Your Bagram engagement in 2019. Your tactical doctrine on multi-axis intercepts. You wrote the playbook we trained from." "That was a long time ago." 3 years isn't a long time, sir." Daniel looked at the 3 pilots standing in front of him. These were the best of the best. F-22 pilots, the top 1% of the top 1%. And they were looking at him like he was something more than a man with grease under his fingernails. He hated it. He loved it. He didn't know which feeling was stronger. The captain spoke for the first time. Her name tag read Nguyen. "Sir, is it true you executed a defensive split against 4 hostile contacts over the Panjshir Valley with a damaged flight control system?" "There were only 3 contacts." "The debrief says 4. "The debrief was wrong. The 4th was a false return on radar. I called it out in real time, but the report never got corrected." Major Collins and Captain Wynne exchanged a look. The kind of look that said, this man just corrected official military records from memory, without blinking. Jake Rollins was shaking his head slowly. "I can't believe this. We had a bet in the squadron about whether you were even a real person. Some of the guys thought Hawk 1 was a composite, like a training construct. Nobody could actually do what the records say you did." "It wasn't that impressive," Daniel said. "Sir, you pulled an 11G turn at 47,000 feet in a jet with a compromised flight computer and still put ordnance on target. That's in every tactical manual we study. I also threw up in my mask afterward. That part didn't make the manual." Jake laughed. It was the kind of laugh that broke tension and let everyone breathe. Even Daniel felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Ethan was standing beside his father now, looking up at the pilots with enormous eyes. The toy Raptor was clutched against his chest. Captain Wynne noticed the boy. She crouched down to his level. "Hey there, what's your name?" "Ethan." "That's a cool jet you've got, Ethan." "It's an F-22 Raptor. My mom gave it to me." "Your mom has good taste." "She died." The words came out flat and simple, the way children deliver the worst truths. Without drama, without cushion, just fact. Captain Wynne didn't flinch. She held the boy's gaze and nodded. "I'm sorry to hear that, Ethan. She must have been pretty special." "She was. She knew Dad was a pilot even though he doesn't like to talk about it." Nguyen looked up at Daniel. Something passed between them. An understanding. The kind of understanding that only people who have sacrificed something enormous can share. Major Collins cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, I'd like to make a phone call, with your permission." "To who?" "Colonel Briggs. He's the base commander. I think he'd want to know you're here." Daniel shifted his weight. "Major, I appreciate it, but I'm not looking for any kind of special treatment. I'm just a guy trying to get to Washington with his kid." "Sir, with all due respect, you're not just a guy. And Colonel Briggs was your squadron commander at Langley. He told me once that losing you was the worst day of his career." Daniel felt like someone had hit him in the sternum. "Briggs is here?" "Took command 6 months ago." "I didn't know that." "He doesn't know you're here either, but I guarantee you he'll want to." Daniel stood still. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. 3 years. 3 years since he'd been in a world that spoke his language, knew his name, understood what he'd done and what it cost him to walk away. 3 years of oil changes and tire rotations and school lunches and bedtime stories and quiet nights on the porch watching jets trace lines across a sky he could no longer touch. And now, here he was, standing in a military terminal with 3 F-22 pilots looking at him like he mattered. He looked down at Ethan. The boy looked back at him with those gray-green eyes that belonged to Sarah. "Dad," Ethan said quietly, "it's okay." "What's okay?" "It's okay to let them see you." Daniel's throat closed. 7 years old. 7 years old, and the kid understood things that took most men a lifetime to figure out. He looked at Major Collins. "Make the call." Collins nodded once and disappeared through the restricted access door. Jake Rollins exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for 5 minutes. "Sir, while we wait, can I get you a coffee? Something from the officer's mess? It's better than the vending machine, I promise." "The vending machine tried to steal my money, so the bar's pretty low." "Welcome to the United States Air Force, sir." This time Daniel actually laughed. A real laugh. It came from somewhere deep, a place that had been locked for a long time, and it surprised him. It surprised everyone. Ethan grinned up at his father. "You never laugh like that, Dad." "I used to." "You should do it more." "Yeah, maybe I should." Captain Nguyen held out her hand to Ethan. "Ethan, you want to come with us to get some real food? We've got a kitchen that makes grilled cheese that'll change your life." Ethan looked at his father for permission. Daniel nodded. "Can I bring my jet?" Ethan asked. "You better bring your jet," Nguyen said. "You can't walk into a fighter squadron without proper equipment." They moved toward the restricted door. Daniel walked behind his son, watching the boy talk animatedly with Captain Nguyen about the differences between the F-22 and the F-35. Information the kid had absorbed from library books and YouTube videos, and late nights asking his father questions that Daniel answered carefully, giving just enough to feed the boy's curiosity, without opening the floodgates of his own grief. As they reached the door, Jake swiped his badge and held it open. He fell into step beside Daniel. "Sir, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why'd you leave?" Daniel walked in silence for a few steps. The corridor was long and gray, standard military construction, and their boots echoed off the hard floor. "My wife was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer," Daniel said. 8 months from diagnosis to funeral. Ethan was 4. He needed a parent, not a deployment schedule. "I'm sorry, sir." "Don't be. I'd make the same choice 1,000 times. "That's why they talk about you the way they do." "Because I quit?" "Because you didn't quit. You just changed missions." Daniel stopped walking. He turned and looked at the young lieutenant. This kid, who couldn't be more than 30, who flew the most advanced fighter jet on Earth, and probably thought he was invincible, the way all young fighter pilots think they're invincible, until the day the world teaches them otherwise. "That might be the smartest thing a lieutenant's ever said to me," Daniel said. Jake grinned. "Don't tell my flight commander. He thinks I'm an idiot." They kept walking. Ethan was up ahead, telling Captain Nguyen about his school, about his best friend Marcus, about the model airplane he was building from a kit his father got him for his birthday. The boy was laughing, and Daniel realized, with a force that nearly stopped him in his tracks, that his son hadn't laughed like that around a stranger in a very long time. They turned a corner and passed through another set of doors, and suddenly they were in the operations wing of an active fighter squadron. Flight schedules on whiteboards, mission briefs tacked to corkboards, the smell of jet fuel and coffee and leather that Daniel knew as well as he knew his own name. His body responded before his mind could catch up. His posture straightened, his chin lifted. His steps fell into a rhythm that wasn't a walk anymore. It was a march. Muscle memory from 1,000 corridors just like this one. Jake noticed. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. Ahead of them, a door opened, and a voice Daniel hadn't heard in 3 years filled the hallway. Well, I'll be damned. Colonel Marcus Briggs stood in the doorway of his office, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, a face carved from granite and discipline and 30 years of military service. He wore his flight suit like it was a second skin, and his eyes, sharp, assessing, and right now filled with something that looked a hell of a lot like emotion, were locked directly on Daniel Carter. "Hawk 1, Briggs said. "In my terminal, in civilian clothes, with grease on his hands." Daniel stood in the corridor and looked at the man who had once pinned wings on his chest. "Colonel?" "It's been 3 years, son." "Yes, sir." "You look terrible." "Thank you, sir." Briggs walked forward. He didn't extend his hand. He wrapped both arms around Daniel and pulled him into a hug that lasted 5 full seconds. When he let go, his eyes were red. "Get in my office," Briggs said. "Both of you. The boy, too." Ethan looked up at the colonel with wide eyes. "Are you in charge of all this?" Briggs looked down at the 7-year-old with the scratched-up toy Raptor. "Son, I'm in charge of this whole base." "Cool. Can I see a real F-22? Briggs looked at Daniel. Daniel shrugged. "Colonel, I've learned not to argue with him. He's more stubborn than any pilot I ever flew with." Briggs laughed, a deep, full, commanding laugh that echoed down the corridor. "Well then," Briggs said, "I think we can arrange something." He put his hand on Daniel's shoulder and guided them into the office, and the door closed behind them. Briggs' office smelled like coffee that had been sitting on a burner too long, and leather that had been worn through decades of service. Daniel sat in the chair across from the colonel's desk and felt the weight of the room settle into his bones. Everything in here was familiar. The squadron photos on the wall, the challenge coins lined up on the shelf, the framed flag behind the desk that had flown over a combat zone. He'd sat in offices like this 100 times, but never as a civilian. Never with grease under his nails, and the 7-year-old beside him eating a granola bar. Ethan had climbed into the second chair and was swinging his legs, too short to reach the floor. He held the toy Raptor on the armrest and studied the squadron photos like he was memorizing every face. Briggs closed the door and walked around his desk. He didn't sit down immediately. He stood behind his chair and just looked at Daniel, the way a man looks at a friend he thought he'd lost. 3 years, Briggs said. Not a phone call, not an email, not a damn Christmas card. I didn't know what to say. How about, "Hey, I'm alive. I'm fixing cars in Fort Worth. My kid's doing okay." Something. Anything. I wasn't sure any of that was true. Briggs sat down slowly. He leaned forward with his elbows on the desk. How bad did it get? Daniel rubbed his hands together. The grease in the creases of his knuckles caught the light. After Sarah died, I had about 4 months of savings. Funeral took most of it. I sold the house in Virginia because I couldn't make the payments. Movement to Fort Worth because Sarah's mother lives there, and I needed someone to watch Ethan while I worked. You could have called me. And said what? Hey, Colonel, the best pilot in your squadron is broke and broken and needs a handout? No, I wasn't going to do that. It wouldn't have been a handout. It would have felt like one. Briggs was quiet for a moment. He looked at Ethan. Your dad's a proud man, son. You know that? Ethan nodded. He's stubborn, too. Runs in the breed. What breed? Fighter pilots. Ethan grinned. Then his face turned serious. Colonel Briggs, can I ask you something? Shoot. Was my dad really good? Like, Really, really good? Briggs leaned back in his chair. He looked at Daniel, who was staring at the floor with the expression of a man who wanted the earth to open and swallow him. Ethan, your dad wasn't good. Good is what we call pilots who don't crash and follow orders. Your dad was something else entirely. There's maybe 5 pilots in the entire United States Air Force who could do what your father did in the air. And I'm being generous with the number 5. What did he do? He did things in a Raptor that the engineers said the jet couldn't do. He flew missions that nobody else would take. And one time, over a place called Afghanistan, he saved 17 people on the ground by staying in a fight that any reasonable pilot would have walked away from. 17 people? 17 American soldiers who would have died that night if your father hadn't been in the sky above them. Ethan turned to his father. You saved 17 people? Daniel's jaw was tight. The guys on the ground did the hard part. I just provided cover. Don't let him do that, Briggs said to Ethan. Don't let him shrink what he did. Your father flew for 6 hours straight in hostile airspace with a damaged jet and refused to disengage until every last soldier was extracted. He landed with 11 minutes of fuel remaining. 11 minutes. You know what we call that in the Air Force? What? We call it insane. And then we give the pilot a medal. Ethan looked at his father with an expression Daniel had never seen before. It wasn't just admiration. It was something deeper. It was the look of a child who was recalculating everything he thought he knew about the person sitting next to him. Dad, why didn't you tell me any of this? Daniel leaned forward and rested his forearms on his knees. He stared at his hands. These hands that everyone kept looking at. These hands that told a story nobody bothered to read. Because heroes in stories are simple, Ethan. They do the brave thing and everybody cheers. Real life isn't like that. I did my job. I did it well. And then your mom got sick, and I had to choose between flying and being your father. I chose you, and I'd choose you again every single time. But choosing you meant leaving the only other thing I was ever good at, and that hurt. It still hurts. Every single day. The room was silent. Briggs rubbed his face with both hands. When he dropped them, his eyes were wet. You stubborn son of a gun, Briggs said softly. You've been carrying all of this alone. Ethan helps me carry it. I carry his lunchbox, Ethan offered. The tension in the room cracked like a window hit by a stone. Briggs laughed. Daniel laughed. Ethan beamed, proud that he'd broken something that needed breaking. Briggs stood up and walked to his window. He looked out at the flight line, where the 6 Raptors sat in their hardened shelters. Daniel, I need to tell you something. The 58th has been running a new tactical program. Dissimilar air combat training, advanced threat simulation, high-end stuff. And every single lesson plan in that program starts with your name. My name? Your engagements, your maneuvers, your after-action reports. Lieutenant Rollins told me last month that the new pilots argue about whether Hawk 1 was a real person or a training myth. They study your flight data like it's scripture. That's flattering, but it doesn't change anything. It changes everything. Because those pilots need more than flight data. They need the man who created it. They need context, judgment, instinct, the stuff that doesn't show up on a screen. Daniel shook his head. Marcus, I fix cars. I pick up my kid from school. I make mac and cheese 4 nights a week because it's the only thing he'll eat without complaining. I'm not the guy you remember. You're exactly the guy I remember. You're just tired. I'm more than tired. Then let me help. I told you, I don't want a handout. Briggs turned from the window. His voice changed. It shifted from friend to commander. I'm not offering a handout. I'm offering a mission. There's a difference, and you know it. Before Daniel could respond, there was a knock at the door. Jake Rollins stuck his head in. Colonel, sorry to interrupt. The maintenance crew heard what's going on. Word travels fast. What kind of word? That Hawk 1 is in the building. Sir, there's about 20 people in the hallway who want to meet him. Briggs looked at Daniel. What do you say? I say this is getting out of hand. Welcome to being a legend. I'm not a legend. Dad, Ethan said, standing up from his chair. Can we go? Can we see the jets? Please? Daniel looked at his son. The boy's eyes were lit up like runways at dusk. Please, Dad. Daniel stood. He took a breath that filled his entire chest. Okay, let's go. Briggs opened the door, and the hallway was full. Not just the 3 pilots from earlier. There were crew chiefs in green coveralls, weapons loaders with grease on their hands that matched Daniel's, maintenance officers, a flight surgeon, 2 intel analysts, and standing at the back, at rigid attention, a senior master sergeant with 30 years of service stripes on his sleeve and tears running down his face. Nobody spoke at first. Then Major Collins, the pilot who had first confirmed Daniel's identity, stepped to the center of the corridor. He faced Daniel and snapped to attention. Hawk 1 on deck, Collins announced. The hallway came alive. Every person in uniform straightened. Heels clicked together. Hands rose to foreheads. 23 salutes, rigid and precise, aimed at a man in a faded jacket with oil stains on his jeans. Daniel stopped walking. He stood in the doorway of Briggs' office with his son at his side and 23 military professionals saluting him, and he did not know what to do with his hands. He wasn't in uniform. He wasn't active duty. Protocol said civilians don't return salutes, but his right arm was already moving. Muscle memory overriding everything. 3 years of civilian life dissolving in the time it took his hand to travel from his side to his temple. He saluted and held it. The senior master sergeant in the back let out a breath that might have been a sob. Ethan stood beside his father, watching. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he understood enough. He understood that these people knew his father. He understood that they respected him. He understood that the man who packed his lunch and drove him to school and fell asleep on the couch with his boots still on was, to these people, something extraordinary. The boy looked up at his father and saw him standing straight for the first time he could remember. Not hunched, not tired, not folded into himself the way he was at the grocery store, or the parent-teacher conference, or the garage. He was standing the way a man stands when he remembers who he is. Ethan's chin trembled, and then, without anyone telling him to, the boy raised his small hand to his forehead and saluted too. The hallway fell apart. Collins broke first. He dropped his salute and pressed his fist against his mouth. Captain Wen turned away and wiped her eyes. Jake Rollins just stood there, shaking his head, with a grin so wide it could have landed a plane. The senior master sergeant walked forward. His name tag read, Patterson. He stopped in front of Daniel and extended his hand. Sir, I was ground crew at Bagram the night you flew the extraction mission. I was the one who chalked your wheels when you landed. Your jet was so low on fuel we couldn't even taxi it. We had to tow it. Daniel took his hand. I remember. You said something to me on the tarmac that night. I said, "You crazy bastard, you actually did it." Yeah, that was it. Patterson gripped Daniel's hand harder. I meant it then. I mean it now. You crazy bastard, sir. Briggs stepped into the hallway. All right, enough standing around getting emotional. Hawk 1's son wants to see an F-22 up close. Who's going to make that happen? Every hand in the corridor went up. They moved through the building and out onto the flight line as a group. Daniel walked in the middle of it, surrounded by pilots and crew, his son riding on the shoulders of Lieutenant Jake Rollins, who held the boy with one arm and pointed out aircraft with the other. "That one's mine," Jake said. "Number 074. I call her Ruthless, but don't tell the colonel, because we're not supposed to name them anymore." "Why not?" "Budget reasons. Naming a jet means you get attached. Getting attached means you get upset when they take it away for maintenance." "That's dumb," Ethan said. "You're absolutely right. It's incredibly dumb." They stopped at a shelter where an F-22 sat in maintenance configuration, panels open, systems accessible, the kind of setup that lets crew work on the internals without moving the jet to a hangar. It was massive up close, 62 feet of stealth geometry and twin-engine fury that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated physics and loved speed. Ethan's mouth fell open. "Dad," he whispered. "Dad!" Daniel stood at the nose of the jet and looked up at it. 3 years. 3 years since he'd been this close. He could smell it. Jet fuel and hydraulic fluid and the faint metallic scent of radar-absorbent material baking in the sun. It hit him like a scent from childhood, like his mother's kitchen or the leather of his first baseball glove. It was the smell of who he used to be. He put his hand on the fuselage. The composite skin was hot from the Texas sun. He ran his fingers along the leading edge of the intake, feeling for imperfections out of habit, the way a mechanic feels for problems before they become emergencies. Captain Wynne appeared beside him. "Still checking our work, sir?" "Force of habit." "Want to see the cockpit?" Daniel hesitated. "I think my son would like that more than me." "I think you're wrong, but let's start with him." Jake lowered Ethan from his shoulders, and Wynne lifted the boy up the integrated boarding ladder. 2 crew chiefs steadied him from below. Ethan climbed into the cockpit of an F-22 Raptor, the same type of aircraft his father had flown in combat, the same aircraft his mother had given him a toy replica of, the same machine that lived in his imagination every time he flew the battered little model through the air of their small apartment. He sat in the ejection seat. His feet couldn't reach the rudder pedals. His hands could barely grip the side stick. The helmet on the canopy rail was 3 sizes too big for his head. None of that mattered. He looked down at his father from the cockpit, and the expression on that boy's face was something that every person on that flight line would remember for the rest of their lives. It was pure, absolute, radiant pride. "Dad," he called down, "I can see everything from up here." Daniel looked up at his son, framed in the cockpit of a Raptor, and his vision blurred. He blinked hard. Then again. It didn't help. "How's it feel?" Daniel called back, his voice rough. "It feels like flying." Patterson, the old crew chief, walked up beside Daniel. He spoke quietly. "We had a pilot once who told me that the first time he sat in a cockpit, he knew he was home." "Who said that?" "You did, sir. Bagram, 2 in the morning. You were sitting on the wing of your jet, eating an MRE, and you said, 'Patterson, the first time I sat in one of these, I was home.' I never forgot it." Daniel watched his son lean forward in the cockpit, studying every switch and display, asking the Wynne questions faster than she could answer them. "I remember saying that," Daniel murmured. "Look at your boy up there. I think home might be hereditary." A commotion near the terminal caught Daniel's attention. He turned and saw a small group of passengers from the diverted flight being led on a brief tour of the base by a public affairs officer, a goodwill gesture to make up for the delay. Most of them were clustered together, taking photos with their phones, gawking at the jets like tourists at a monument. And at the edge of the group, standing apart, was Victoria Ashford. She had seen everything: the salutes in the hallway, the pilots surrounding Daniel, the crew chiefs shaking his hand. his son in the cockpit. All of it. She stood perfectly still, her arms at her sides, her phone forgotten in her hand. The wind caught her hair, and she didn't fix it. The sun was in her eyes, and she didn't shield them. She just watched. Daniel saw her. Their eyes met across 40 yards of tarmac. She didn't look away. Neither did he. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Two people from two different worlds, standing on the same ground, with everything they thought they knew about the other turned completely upside down. Then Victoria did something Daniel didn't expect. She lowered her head. Not a nod, not a gesture. Something more. Something that cost her something. She lowered her head the way a person does when they are truly, deeply ashamed. Daniel turned back to the jet. "Hey, Ethan," he called up. "You about ready to come down?" "5 more minutes, Dad. Please." "That's what you said 5 minutes ago." "5 more after that, then." The crew laughed. Jake clapped Daniel on the shoulder. Patterson shook his head with a grin. Nguyen was up on the ladder, showing Ethan how the heads-up display worked, and the boy was absorbing every word like he'd been born to sit in that seat. Briggs walked up beside Daniel. They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the boy. "He's got your eyes," Briggs said. "He's got his mother's eyes. He's got your focus. Watch how he tracks every instrument. He's not just looking, he's reading. He's processing. That's you, Daniel. That's pure Hawk 1. He's 7. You were 7 once, and I bet you did the exact same thing the first time you saw a cockpit." Daniel said nothing, because Briggs was right. "I wasn't kidding about the consulting position," Briggs said. "Part-time, flexible schedule. You work around Ethan's school. You come down 2, maybe 3 days a week. You teach these young pilots what the flight data can't teach them." "And what's that?" "How to think when everything goes wrong. How to make decisions in 3 seconds that take analysts 3 weeks to second guess. How to stay in the fight when every instrument is telling you to leave." "I don't have a flight suit anymore." "We have a closet full of them." "I don't have a clearance anymore." "I can have that reinstated in 48 hours. "I have a son who needs me." "And he'll have a father who's not just surviving. He'll have a father who's alive again." That last one landed. It landed hard. Daniel felt it in his chest, in his gut, in the backs of his eyes. Because Briggs wasn't wrong. For 3 years, Daniel had been surviving. Making it through each day. Paying the bills, feeding the boy, keeping the lights on and the car running, and the grief locked down below the waterline where nobody could see it. But he hadn't been alive. Not really. Not the way he was alive right now, standing on a flight line with jet fuel in the air, and his son in a cockpit, and people around him who knew his name and what it meant. "I'll think about it," Daniel said. "Don't think too long. The Air Force doesn't wait around for anyone, not even legends." "I'm not a legend." "Daniel, look around you." Daniel looked. He saw pilots who studied his missions, crew chiefs who remembered his name, a base commander who hugged him in his office, a boy in a cockpit who was smiling wider than he'd smiled since his mother was alive. "Okay," Daniel said quietly. "Maybe I'm a little bit of a legend." Briggs grinned. "That's the most self-aware thing you've ever said." Ethan finally came down from the cockpit. Captain Nguyen carried him on her hip down the ladder, and when his feet hit the tarmac, he ran straight to his father and threw his arms around Daniel's waist. "Dad, I sat in your jet." "I saw." "It smelled funny." "That's jet fuel. I like it." "Your mother hated it. She said I always came home smelling like a gas station." "Mom was wrong. It smells like you." Daniel picked up his son and held him. The boy wrapped his arms around his neck and pressed his face against his shoulder. The toy Raptor dug into Daniel's back, and he didn't care. He held his son on the flight line of an Air Force base, surrounded by Raptors and pilots and crew. And for the first time in 3 years, he felt something he had forgotten existed. He felt whole. The announcement came over the terminal's PA system 40 minutes later. The replacement aircraft had arrived. Passengers were asked to begin reboarding at Gate 2. Daniel was sitting in the officers' mess with Ethan on one side and Colonel Briggs on the other. Jake Rollins and Captain Wynne were across the table. Patterson, the old crew chief, had pulled up a chair at the end and was telling Ethan about the time a bird got sucked into an engine intake during a training sortie, and the entire maintenance crew had to spend 3 days pulling feathers out of a turbine. 3 days? Ethan said, eyes wide. 3 days, and it wasn't a small bird. It was a pelican. A pelican? Biggest pelican you've ever seen. We named him Gerald. You named the bird that got sucked into the engine? We named what was left of him. It's a coping mechanism. Ethan looked at his father. Dad, is that true? Daniel nodded. Bird strikes happen more than you'd think. I hit a hawk once over Nevada. A hawk? Ironic, right? Hawk won versus an actual hawk. Who won? The jet won. The hawk did not have a good day. The table laughed, and then the PA crackled again and the laughter faded, because the announcement meant this was ending. This strange, unexpected pocket of time where Daniel had been allowed to be someone he hadn't been in 3 years was closing. The real world was calling them back. Washington. The reason they were on the plane in the first place. Ethan's face fell. Do we have to go? We do, bud. Grandma's expecting us. Can't we stay? Just a little longer? We'll miss our flight. I don't care about the flight. I like it here. Daniel felt the pull of that statement in every direction at once. He liked it here too, more than he wanted to admit, more than was safe to admit, because liking something meant wanting it, and wanting something meant losing it could destroy you. And he'd already lost enough. Briggs stood up from the table. Daniel, walk with me. They left the mess hall and walked down a corridor toward the main terminal. Briggs kept his pace slow and deliberate, the walk of a man who had something to say and was choosing his words carefully. I watched your boy in that cockpit, Briggs said. He loved it. He didn't just love it. He understood it. Newen told me he asked her about the angle of attack indicator. A 7-year-old asked about AOA. She almost fell off the ladder. He reads a lot. He does more than read. He absorbs. He processes. He asks the right questions in the right order. Daniel, that kid's mind works like yours. That terrifies me. It should inspire you. It does both. They turned a corner and Briggs stopped. He faced Daniel directly. I'm going to be straight with you, because that's what you always respected from me, and I'm not going to change now. You're wasting yourself. You know it. I know it. Those pilots back there know it. The kid knows it. I'm providing for my son. You're providing a paycheck. That's not the same thing. It keeps the lights on. And that's enough for you? Lights on? Food in the fridge? Bare minimum survival? Because the Daniel Carter I knew didn't do bare minimum anything. The Daniel Carter you knew had a wife. Briggs absorbed that. He didn't flinch, but he let the weight of it settle before he spoke again. Sarah wouldn't want this for you. Don't do that. Don't do what? Don't tell me what my wife would want. You didn't know her the way I did. You're right, I didn't. But I knew you, and I know what she saw in you, because everyone who ever met you saw it. You are built for something bigger than an oil change, Daniel. You have a mind that can process tactical scenarios faster than any computer the Air Force has ever built. You have instincts that saved lives, real lives, American lives. And you're using those instincts to diagnose check engine lights. Those check engine lights matter to the people who bring me their cars. I'm not saying they don't. I'm saying you can do both. You can be a mechanic, and you can be a teacher. You can fix cars Monday through Wednesday, and come down here Thursday and Friday and teach my pilots how to survive. Your pilots are fine. My pilots are good. Good isn't enough. Good gets you through training. Good doesn't get you through combat. What gets you through combat is the kind of thinking that doesn't exist in a manual. And the only man I've ever known who can teach that thinking is standing in front of me right now, arguing about it, instead of saying yes. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. His muscles were tight. Everything was tight. 3 years of holding himself together through sheer stubbornness, and now this man, this colonel, this friend, was pulling at the seams. If I say yes, Daniel said slowly, what does that look like? Practically, day to day. Because I can't uproot Ethan. He's got school, he's got friends, he's got a routine. Stability is the only thing I can give him that doesn't cost money. Fort Worth to here is an hour and 20 minutes. I'll arrange base housing for overnight stays. Ethan can come with you. We have a school on base for dependents. He can sit in on the youth program. Hell, I'll have Nguyen babysit him. She already volunteered. She did? Before you even left the flight line. She told me, and I'm quoting her directly, "Colonel, that kid is the best thing that's happened to this squadron in 2 years." She wasn't wrong. Daniel almost smiled. Ethan does have that effect on people. So does his father, when his father lets people in. They stood in silence for a moment. Down the corridor, Daniel could hear the muffled noise of passengers gathering their things, the shuffle of bags and shoes, and the low murmur of people who just wanted to get where they were going. I need time, Daniel said. You have 48 hours. After that, I have to submit the staffing request to command, and I need a name on the line. 48 hours. That's what I said. You always were impatient. And you always were stubborn. We make a great team. They shook hands, not the polite, professional handshake of colleagues, the grip of two men who had been through something together and never fully let go. Briggs reached into his flight suit pocket and pulled out a business card. Plain white, blue lettering. Colonel Marcus Briggs, 58th Fighter Squadron, with a phone number and an email address. Call me, Briggs said. Don't disappear again. I won't. Promise me. Daniel took the card. He held it between his thumb and forefinger and looked at it the way a man looks at a key that might open a door he's been standing outside of for 3 years. I promise. They walked back to the terminal together. Ethan was waiting near the boarding area with Jake Rollins. The young lieutenant had given the boy a squadron patch, the 58th Fighter Squadron emblem, a Raptor silhouette against a red star. Ethan had pressed it against his jacket like it was a medal. Dad, look what Lieutenant Jake gave me. I see it. What do you say? Thank you, Lieutenant Jake. Jake crouched down to the boy's level. Ethan, you keep studying those jets, okay? And you take care of your dad. He needs it more than he'll ever admit. I know. He doesn't eat enough vegetables. That tracks. Jake stood and extended his hand to Daniel. Sir, it was the honor of my career to meet you today. I mean that. Daniel shook his hand. Fly safe, Lieutenant, and name your jets. Budget reasons be damned. Jake laughed. Yes, sir. Captain Nguyen appeared and hugged Ethan without asking permission. The boy hugged her back with both arms. She whispered something in his ear that Daniel couldn't hear, and Ethan nodded seriously, the way children do when they've been told something important by someone they trust. What did she say? Daniel asked after Nguyen stepped back. Ethan looked up at him. She said my mom would be really proud of both of us. Daniel's jaw clenched. He nodded at Nguyen. She nodded back. No words needed. Patterson was last. The old crew chief walked up to Daniel and didn't shake his hand. He reached into his coverall pocket and pulled out a small metal object. A challenge coin. Worn smooth from years of being carried. On one side, the crest of the Bagram Maintenance Detachment. On the other, a phrase Daniel recognized immediately. "Keep them flying," Daniel read. "That's our motto, maintenance crew. We don't get the glory. We don't get the medals. We keep the jets in the air, so pilots like you can do what you do. I've carried that coin for 9 years. I want your boy to have it." "Patterson, I can't take your coin." "You're not taking it. You're passing it on. That's what coins are for." Daniel took the coin and handed it to Ethan. The boy turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of it, the smoothness, the engraving. "What do I do with it?" Ethan asked. "You keep it," Patterson said. "And when you're having a bad day, you hold it and you remember that a bunch of people in uniform thought you were pretty special." "Thank you, Sergeant Patterson." "You're welcome, young man. You're welcome." The boarding call came again. Final call. Daniel took Ethan's hand, and they walked toward the gate. He turned once and looked back at the group of pilots and crew who had gathered to see them off. Briggs stood at the center, arms crossed, watching with the expression of a man who had just set something in motion and knew it. Daniel raised his hand, a simple wave, not a salute, something more personal than that. Briggs raised his hand in return. Then Daniel turned and walked through the gate. The jetway felt different this time, narrower somehow. Or maybe the world he was re-entering just felt smaller than the one he was leaving. They boarded the replacement aircraft and found their seats. Same arrangement, window and middle. Row 3. The aisle seat was empty. Ethan buckled in and immediately pressed his face against the window, craning to see the flight line. "Dad, I can still see the Raptors from here." "Yeah? They look small from here." "Everything looks small from a distance." Passengers filed in around them. Different energy now. Less tension. The diversion had bonded them the way shared emergencies do. Turned strangers into people who nodded each other with something approaching warmth. A man across the aisle leaned over. He was maybe 60, gray-haired, wearing a veteran's cap. "That your boy?" "Yes, sir." "Saw what happened on the flight line. The salute. My buddy texted me a photo." "Someone took a photo?" "Son, everyone took a photo. It's all over the base. The old crew chief said Hawk 1 was in the building. I served 22 years in the Navy, and I know what that kind of respect means. Whatever you did to earn it, thank you." Daniel didn't know what to say. He nodded. The man nodded back and settled into his seat. Then Victoria Ashford appeared. She stood at the end of the row the same way she had the first time, but everything about her was different. Her posture was different. Her face was different. The armor she'd worn like a second skin had cracked, and what was underneath looked raw and exposed and deeply uncomfortable. She looked at the aisle seat. She looked at Daniel. "Is this seat still mine?" she asked. Her voice was quiet. "It's all yours." She sat down. She didn't adjust her jacket to avoid touching him. She didn't pull out her laptop. She didn't build a wall. She sat, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she stared straight ahead at the seat in front of her. 30 seconds passed. A minute. Ethan was absorbed in the window. The flight attendants were doing their final checks. "Mr. Carter," Victoria said. "Yes, ma'am." "I owe you something that I'm not very good at giving." Daniel waited. "I owe you an apology." "Okay." "I watched what happened out there, on the flight line. I saw those pilots salute you. I saw your son in that cockpit. I heard people talking about missions and tactics and things I don't even understand, and I'm the senior vice president of a defense contractor. I sit in meetings about these aircraft, and I didn't know. I didn't know who you were. You didn't need to know who I was to treat us with decency. That landed. Victoria's lips pressed together. She nodded slowly. You're right. I didn't need to know. That's the whole point, isn't it? Yes, ma'am. That's the whole point. I was cruel to your son. I dismissed him. He showed me his toy, and I shut him down. He's 7 years old, and I treated him like an inconvenience. You did. I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry. Daniel turned to face her fully for the first time. He studied her the way he used to study a threat assessment. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, with precision. Mrs. Ashford, I appreciate the apology, and I'll accept it on my own behalf. But the person you need to apologize to is sitting by the window holding a toy jet that his dead mother gave him. Victoria flinched. The word dead hit her like a physical thing. Her eyes went glassy. I didn't know. You didn't ask. She was quiet for a long time. The engines started. The plane began to push back from the gate. The familiar sounds of departure filled the cabin. Ethan, Victoria said. The boy turned from the window. He looked at her with the guarded expression of a child who remembers being dismissed. Hi, she said. Hi. I was rude to you earlier, when you showed me your jet. That was wrong of me, and I'm sorry. Ethan looked at her. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he held up the toy Raptor. It's an F-22 Raptor, he said. My mom gave it to me before she died. It can go Mach 2. That's 1,534 miles per hour. Victoria looked at the toy. She really looked at it this time. The chipped paint, the missing landing gear, the tape holding one wing together. She saw it for what it was. Not a cheap toy, not a distraction. A relic. A piece of a mother's love preserved in scratched plastic. That's very fast, she said softly. The fastest fighter jet in the world, Ethan said. My dad used to fly one. I know, I saw. Do you want to hold it? The question hung in the air. Victoria looked at Daniel. He didn't give her permission. He didn't refuse it either. He just watched. She reached out and took the toy from Ethan's hand. She held it carefully. The way a person holds something they suddenly understand is priceless. It's light, she said. It's made of plastic. The real one weighs 43,000 pounds. You know a lot about these. My dad taught me, and library books, and YouTube. Victoria handed the toy back. Ethan took it and turned back to the window, satisfied. The grudge, if a 7-year-old can hold one, had been released. Children forgive faster than adults, not because they forget, because they haven't yet learned that holding on to anger feels powerful. They still know the truth, that letting go is the stronger move. Victoria leaned back in her seat. She didn't speak for a while. The plane taxied and took off. The base fell away below them. Daniel watched through the window over Ethan's shoulder as the Raptors on the flight line shrank to silver specks and then disappeared entirely. When they reached cruising altitude, Victoria spoke again. Can I tell you something, Mr. Carter? Go ahead. I work in defense. I've been in the industry for 23 years. I've sat across the table from generals and admirals and secretaries of defense. I've negotiated contracts worth billions. And today, standing on that tarmac, watching a group of pilots salute a mechanic from Fort Worth, I realized something that 23 years in the industry never taught me. What's that? That I don't know a damn thing about what matters. Daniel looked at her. For the first time, he didn't see the armor. He didn't see the title. He didn't see the suit or the earrings or the leather bag. He saw a woman who had just been hit by something she couldn't negotiate her way out of. "That's a hard thing to realize," he said. "It's humiliating." "No, humiliating is having your son's toy dismissed by a stranger on an airplane. Realizing you were wrong is just growth." Victoria closed her eyes. A single tear tracked down her left cheek. She wiped it quickly, the way people do when they don't want to be seen falling apart. "I have a daughter," she said. "She's 19. She goes to Stanford. I paid for the best schools, the best tutors, the best everything. But she doesn't call me." "She hasn't called me in 6 months. And today, watching your son look at you the way he does, I think I understand why." "Why?" "Because I gave her everything, except what you give Ethan." "What do I give Ethan?" "Yourself." The word sat between them like something holy. Daniel didn't respond. There was nothing to respond with. She'd found her own truth, and it wasn't his to validate or deny. Ethan had fallen asleep against the window. The toy Raptor was tucked under his arm. The squadron patch Jake had given him was pressed between his hand and his chest. The challenge coin from Patterson was in his jacket pocket. He slept the way only children sleep, totally, completely, without reservation. Daniel reached over and adjusted the boy's seatbelt. He brushed a strand of hair off his forehead. He pulled the thin airline blanket up to his chin. Victoria watched him do all of this. Every small, practiced, tender gesture. "He's lucky to have you," she said. "I'm the lucky one." "You both are." Daniel leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. His body was exhausted. 31 hours without sleep, a double shift, a diverted flight, an emotional earthquake on a military base, and now the steady hum of an aircraft carrying him toward Washington and whatever came next. But his mind wouldn't stop. Briggs's offer circled through his thoughts like a fighter in a holding pattern. Part-time consulting, teaching tactical awareness, shaping the next generation of pilots. 2 days a week, flexible schedule, base housing for overnights. Ethan could come. Wynn had volunteered to watch him. It was everything he wanted, wrapped in everything he feared. Because saying yes meant going back. Not all the way back. Not into the cockpit, not into combat, but back into the world that had defined him, the world he'd loved, the world he'd left. And going back meant feeling everything he'd spent 3 years burying. The pride, the loss, the identity crisis of a man who was born to fly and chose to stay on the ground. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Briggs' business card. He held it between his fingers in the dark of the cabin, feeling the edges, reading the number by memory, even though he'd only looked at it once. 48 hours. That's what Briggs had given him. 48 hours to decide if he was ready to be Hawk 1 again, or at least some version of him. The plane flew on through the darkening sky. Ethan slept. Victoria sat in silence. Daniel held the business card and listened to the engines and felt the old, familiar pull of the sky outside the window. And somewhere below, on a tarmac in Texas, 6 F-22 Raptors sat in their shelters, waiting. They landed in Washington at 9:47 at night. Ethan woke up during the descent, blinking against the cabin lights, the toy Raptor still tucked under his arm. He pressed his face against the window and watched the city lights spread out below them like a circuit board glowing in the dark. "Dad, is that the White House?" "I think that's a Walmart, bud." "Oh." The plane touched down smoothly. Passengers stood and reached for overhead bins and moved with the tired urgency of people at the end of a long day that had been longer than expected. Daniel waited. He always waited. Let others go first. It was habit. Military habit. Civilian habit. Maybe just Daniel habit. Victoria stood and pulled her bag from the overhead compartment. She paused beside their row. She looked at Ethan, then at Daniel. "Mr. Carter." "Mrs. Ashford?" She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I'd like to give you my card. Not for business, not for networking. I just think there are things I could learn from you. And if your son ever wants a tour of Harmon Defense Systems, where we build parts of the aircraft he loves so much, I'd like to arrange that." She held out a business card. Daniel looked at it. 2 business cards in one day. One from a colonel offering him a mission. One from the woman who had dismissed his son, offering something that looked a lot like redemption. He took it. "Thank you." "Thank you for not making this harder than it needed to be. You did the hard part. Apologizing takes more guts than most people think. Coming from a man who flew combat missions, I'll take that as a compliment." She walked away. Her heels clicked against the jetway floor, and then she was gone, swallowed by the terminal crowd, carrying something different than what she'd carried when she boarded. Daniel and Ethan made their way through the airport. The boy was dragging, half asleep on his feet, his backpack bouncing against his legs. Daniel picked him up. Ethan wrapped his arms around his father's neck and rested his head against his shoulder, the way he'd done since he was 2, the way Daniel hoped he'd keep doing for as long as physics allowed. "Dad?" "Yeah, buddy." "Today was the best day of my life." "Better than Disney World?" "We've never been to Disney World." "Right. I keep meaning to fix that." "Today was better than Disney World would have been anyway." "How do you know?" "Because Disney World doesn't have real F-22s. Daniel smiled against the top of his son's head. "Can't argue with that logic." Sarah's mother, Linda, was waiting at arrivals. She was a small woman with silver hair and Sarah's cheekbones, and the kind of eyes that looked like they'd been doing too much crying and not enough sleeping for the past 3 years. She saw Daniel carrying Ethan, and her face did that thing it always did, a quick flash of grief, followed by a forced smile. Because every time she saw her grandson, she saw her daughter. "How was the flight?" she asked, reaching for Ethan. "We got diverted to an Air Force base." "What?" "Engine issue. Everybody's fine. Ethan had the time of his life." "Grandma," Ethan said, lifting his head, "I sat in a real F-22, a real one, and pilots saluted Dad. And the lady was mean, but then she said sorry, and I got a patch and a coin, and Captain Nguyen showed me the heads-up display." Linda looked at Daniel over the boy's head. Her eyes were wide. "I'll explain later," Daniel said. They drove to Linda's house in Arlington. It was a modest place, a 2-bedroom colonial on a quiet street where the neighbors kept their lawns trimmed and their opinions to themselves. Sarah had grown up here. Her bedroom was still upstairs, exactly as she'd left it when she went to college. Linda couldn't change it. Daniel understood that. He had a box of Sarah's clothes in his closet in Fort Worth that he couldn't open either. Ethan was asleep before they pulled into the driveway. Daniel carried him inside and laid him on the guest bed. He pulled off the boy's shoes and covered him with the quilt Linda kept folded at the foot of the bed. The toy Raptor went on the pillow beside him. The squadron patch went on the nightstand. The challenge coin stayed in his jacket pocket. Daniel stood in the doorway and watched his son sleep. He did this every night at home. It was the only time the world was completely quiet and completely safe. In those moments, watching Ethan breathe, Daniel could convince himself that he was doing enough. That mac and cheese and packed lunches and bedtime stories were enough. That showing up was enough. But tonight, the math felt different. Tonight he'd stood on a flight line and remembered who he was. He went downstairs. Linda had made tea. She set a cup on the kitchen table and sat across from him. "Tell me," she said. So he told her. All of it. The executive on the plane, the diversion, the pilots, the salute, Briggs, the consulting offer. Everything he'd carried off that tarmac and onto the next plane, and through the airport and into this kitchen. Linda listened without interrupting. When he finished, she wrapped both hands around her cup and was quiet for a long time. "Sarah would tell you to take it," she said. "I know. She used to say you were the best version of yourself when you were flying. Not because you loved the speed or the danger, because you loved the purpose." "I have purpose. Ethan is my purpose." "Ethan is your reason. Purpose is different. Reason is why you get up. Purpose is why you feel alive when you do." Daniel stared at his tea. It was getting cold. He hadn't taken a sip. "Linda, I'm scared." She reached across the table and put her hand on his. It was the first time he'd admitted that to anyone. Not to Briggs, not to the pilots, not to himself. He'd said it to his dead wife's mother, in a kitchen in Arlington, at 11 o'clock at night, and the words hung in the air like a confession. "What are you scared of?" she asked. "That I'll go back, and I won't be good enough anymore. That 3 years of oil changes rusted whatever I used to have. That I'll stand in front of those young pilots, and they'll see a mechanic pretending to be something he used to be." "Daniel." "Yeah?" "You sat in a commercial aircraft today and diagnosed an engine problem from your seat. You told a woman the exact time you'd land, and you were off by 18 seconds. You corrected an official military debrief from memory. 3 years didn't rust anything. You just covered it up." He looked at her. This woman who had every reason to resent him, because he was alive and her daughter wasn't. Because he'd taken Sarah away from Arlington and into a military life that was all deployments and relocations and lonely nights. Because in the end, he was the one who stayed, and Sarah was the one who left. But Linda had never resented him. Not once. Not even on the worst days. "You sound like your daughter," Daniel said. "Where do you think she got it?" He almost smiled. Almost. "What about Ethan?" he asked. "I take this job, even part-time. It means time away from him. Base visits, overnights. He's already lost his mother. I can't ask him to share his father." "You're not asking him to share you. You're asking him to watch you become whole again. Children don't need a parent who sacrifices everything. They need a parent who shows them what it looks like to live." "When'd you get so wise?" "I raised Sarah. That was a full education." Daniel picked up his tea and finally drank. It was cold. He didn't care. "I'm going to call Briggs tomorrow," he said. "Good." "I'm going to say yes." "Good." "I'm terrified." "Also good. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Daniel. You know that better than anyone alive." He finished his tea and said goodnight. He went upstairs and checked on Ethan one more time. The boy had rolled onto his side, one arm flung across the pillow, the toy Raptor wedged between his cheek and the pillowcase. His breathing was slow and deep and perfect. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed. He pulled out Briggs' business card and Victoria Ashford's business card and laid them both on the nightstand next to the squadron patch. 3 pieces of paper that represented 3 different things. A mission. A lesson. A bridge. He slept that night for the first time in weeks, without dreaming about Sarah's hospital room. The next morning, Ethan was up before him. The boy was sitting on the living room floor in his pajamas, the toy Raptor in one hand and the challenge coin in the other, arranging them on the carpet in some configuration that only made sense to a 7-year-old military tactician. "Morning, Dad." "Morning. You're up early." "I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the jets." Daniel sat down on the floor beside him. His knees cracked. His back was stiff from 31 hours without sleep, followed by 6 hours on a guest bed that was slightly too short. "Ethan, I need to talk to you about something." "Okay." "You know Colonel Briggs, the man at the base? The one who's in charge of everything?" "Yeah, he offered me a job." Ethan's eyes lit up. "At the base?" "Part-time, 2 or 3 days a week. I'd teach young pilots, help them learn things about flying that they can't get from books." "Would you fly again?" "No, I'd teach, from the ground." "Would I get to come?" "Sometimes. They have a school on base, and Captain Wynne said she'd look after you." "Captain Wynne is awesome." "She seems pretty awesome, yeah." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He turned the challenge coin over in his hand. "Dad, would you be happy?" The question was so simple and so enormous that Daniel had to take a breath before answering. "Yeah, bud. I think I would be." "Then why are you asking me? Just say yes." "Because your opinion matters more than anyone's." Ethan looked at his father with those gray-green eyes, Sarah's eyes. And then he said something that Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. "Dad, when we were at the base, you stood up tall. You laughed. You talked to people like you weren't tired. You were different. You were the way you are in the pictures Mom kept, the ones where you're wearing the flight suit and smiling. I want that, Dad. The one who smiles." Daniel's vision blurred. He reached for his son and pulled him close. The boy pressed against his chest, warm and small and solid and real. "I'm going to call him," Daniel said. "Right now." "Right now?" "Right now." He pulled out his phone. He pulled out the business card. He dialed. 3 rings. "Briggs?" "Colonel, it's Daniel Carter." A pause. Then Briggs' voice, carrying the weight of a grin Daniel could hear through the phone. "That was fast. I gave you 48 hours. "I didn't need 48 hours. "And?" Daniel looked at Ethan. The boy was watching him with everything he had. Hope and pride and love and a 7-year-old's unshakable faith that his father could do anything. "I'm in," Daniel said. Briggs exhaled. "Welcome back, Hawk 1. "I'm not Hawk 1 anymore, Colonel." "The hell you're not. Report to base next Thursday. 0800. Wear something without grease on it." "No promises." Briggs laughed. "I'll have the paperwork ready. And Daniel?" "Yeah?" "It's good to have you back, son." "It's good to be back, sir." He hung up. Ethan was bouncing on his knees. "What did he say?" "He said welcome back." "Are you going?" "Thursday." "Can I come?" "First trip, no. I need to get settled. After that, yes." "Promise?" "Promise." Ethan threw his arms around his father's neck so hard they both fell backward onto the carpet. The toy Raptor dug into Daniel's shoulder blade, and the challenge coin pressed into his ribs, and his son was laughing. Really laughing. The kind of laughter that fills a room and doesn't apologize for itself. Linda appeared in the doorway. She was holding a coffee mug, and her eyes were wet. "You called him," she said. "I called him." "Sarah is smiling right now. Wherever she is, she's smiling." Daniel lay on the carpet with his son on his chest and stared at the ceiling. He thought about Sarah. He thought about the way she used to stand in the kitchen doorway when he came home from a deployment, arms crossed, trying to look angry, failing completely because her smile always gave her away. He thought about Ethan in that cockpit, looking down at him with an expression of pure pride. He thought about the salute in the hallway. 23 hands raised to their foreheads for a man in a faded jacket. He thought about Victoria Ashford lowering her head on the tarmac, and a crew chief named Patterson handing his most prized possession to a 7-year-old stranger. He thought about Briggs saying, "Welcome back," with a voice that cracked on the second word. And he thought about his own hands, greased, scarred, calloused. Hands that fixed engines and packed lunches and held his dying wife and carried his sleeping son and saluted without thinking, because some things live so deep in your body that 3 years on the ground can't reach them. Those hands would hold a flight manual again. They would point to a tactical display. They would grip a young pilot's shoulder and say, "Here's what they don't teach you." They would still change oil. They would still pack lunches. They would still carry Ethan when the boy was too tired to walk. They would do all of it, because that's what hands are for. Not one thing, everything. That afternoon, Daniel and Ethan took the metro into the city. Linda had given them directions to the Air and Space Museum, because Ethan had been begging to go for 2 years, and Daniel had always said, "Someday," in the way parents say someday when they mean, "I can't afford it right now." But the museum was free. He'd checked. Twice. They walked through the main hall, and Ethan moved from exhibit to exhibit with the focus of a doctoral student, reading every placard, studying every aircraft, asking questions that Daniel answered with the quiet authority of a man who had lived what these displays could only describe. They stopped at the fighter jet exhibit. An F-22 Raptor model hung from the ceiling on cables, frozen in a climbing turn. Ethan held up his toy and compared them. "Same jet," the boy said. "Same jet." "Dad?" "Yeah?" "Are you important?" Daniel looked at his son. This small, brilliant, stubborn, beautiful boy who had his mother's eyes and his father's focus, and a toy jet held together with tape and love and the last breath of a woman who knew she was leaving, but wanted to leave something behind that her son could hold. "I'm important to you," Daniel said. "That's the most important kind," Ethan said. "Yeah, it is. And now you're important to the pilots, too." "I suppose I am. And to Colonel Briggs." "Yeah. And to Captain Wynne." "Probably." "And to Lieutenant Jake." "Okay, I get it." "And to Sergeant Patterson." "And to the lady on the plane." "And to Grandma." "And to Mrs. Ramirez, whose car you fixed." "And to Mr. Tran." "And to me. Especially to me." Daniel crouched down so he was eye level with his son. He put both hands on the boy's shoulders. Those grease-stained, scarred, calloused hands that the world kept judging and his son kept holding. "Ethan, listen to me. Everything I did in the Air Force, every mission, every flight, every time I strapped into that jet and went into the sky, none of it compares to this. None of it compares to standing in a museum with you, talking about airplanes, knowing that I get to take you home and make you dinner and help you with your homework and tuck you in tonight. That's the mission. You are the mission. You always were." Ethan nodded, serious, certain. 7 years old and made of steel. "I know, Dad, but it's okay to have 2 missions." Daniel pulled his son into a hug, right there in the middle of the Air and Space Museum, surrounded by tourists and school groups and the ghosts of every pilot who ever traded Earth for sky. He held on tight. And for the first time in 3 years, when he let go, he didn't feel like he was losing something. He felt like he was beginning. They walked out of the museum into the late afternoon sun. Ethan ran ahead, holding the toy Raptor above his head, banking it left and right, making engine sounds that echoed off the marble steps. Daniel watched his son and felt something settle in his chest. Not grief, not relief. Something deeper and quieter and more permanent than either. He reached into his pocket and touched the challenge coin Patterson had given Ethan. The boy had handed it to Daniel for safekeeping, the way children hand their treasures to their parents because they know, without question, without doubt, that their parents will keep them safe. Daniel closed his fingers around the coin and held it tight. Keep them flying. That had been Patterson's motto, the maintenance crew's creed. Keep the jets in the air. Keep the pilots safe. Keep the mission going. Daniel had a new version now. Keep your son laughing. Keep your hands working. Keep showing up. Keep standing tall, even when the world tells you to sit down. Keep honoring the woman who loved you by raising the boy she left behind. Keep saying yes to the life that's waiting for you, even when you're terrified, especially when you're terrified. Keep flying. Not in a cockpit, not at Mach 2, not at 40,000 feet, but keep flying. Ethan turned around at the bottom of the steps, grinning, the toy Raptor catching the sunlight. "Come on, Dad!" Daniel Carter, mechanic, father, Hawk 1, walked down the steps toward his son. His hands were still dirty. He didn't wash them. They were proof that he showed up. And showing up every single day for the people who needed him, whether they wore flight suits or school uniforms, whether they sat in cockpits or kitchen chairs, whether they saluted him or just held his hand on an airplane when the world got scary. That was the only mission that ever truly mattered. Daniel Carter was not a broken man who used to fly. He was a father who never stopped.